The thing that connects the moon and climate happened for me on the steps of the University of Victoria, Wellington. I was sitting one day with a notebook in my hand and trying to consolidate the sense that there was sort of an insight coming forward and I needed to capture it. And I just wrote down 2 words in the notebook, and it was ownership and governance.
Welcome to The Regeneration Will Be Funded. My name is Matthew Monahan, and in this series, we're exploring the intersections of regenerative finance, technology, and our living planet. Created with Ma Earth, you can find all of our conversations and more at maearth.com. Thanks for joining us. Welcome. Today's conversation is with Chelsea Robinson from Open Lunar Foundation. Chelsea is such a brilliant and prolific contributor to all things systems change. In the first half of this discussion, we talk about the moon. I learned a lot, and it reframed some things for me about this lunar renaissance that we find ourselves in. Then we go into Chelsea's lessons from the climate space, where she's contributed to many different initiatives and projects. And she offers a number of awesome insights about governance, particularly useful for those of us thinking about Web3, DAOs, voting, new forms of governance and coordination. And Chelsea reflects on what makes Aotearoa, New Zealand so special. Chelsea is from New Zealand originally, and it's also where I get to call home. Finally, Chelsea offers her reflections on what's next, the importance of healthcare, what's coming in the environmental space, and really important for us to think about. A few surprising comments there, and also some of the things that she's concerned about. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did with Chelsea Robinson. Welcome, Chelsea Robinson. Chelsea is a serial entrepreneur and senior advisor to Open Lunar Foundation. Thanks for being here, Chelsea.
Thanks for having me, Matthew.
What is Open Lunar Foundation?
Open Lunar is an organization seeking to create lunar stewardship in practice. It's a nonprofit 501c3 created in 2018 to help support this new resurgence, this lunar renaissance of activity towards visiting the moon, developing the surface of the moon, to guide it to occur in a way that is driven by values. That could be working with government and private sector, and including civil society as well, to create a shared vision and template for how we want to operate on the moon in the future. Mm-hmm. Because this is not a maybe, this is happening right now. 10 missions in the next 18 months. There's an enormous amount of capacity going towards this shared goal. And so as a nonprofit, we help to glue together that conversation and provide a vision for how we could do it better together.
Mm. So many of us, myself included, may not have this context that there is this lunar renaissance happening. Like when I think about the moon missions, I think JFK and 60s and 70s, and then we kind of just stopped for a while going back. Help us understand what's the recent context that's maybe catalyzed this new resurgence of interest.
Yeah, you're right. There was an incredible amount of activity that happened towards the moon in the 60s in the United States, and also around the Cold War and how that all developed with the space race. Since then, we've seen a completely different kind of technological acceleration. The development of something like an iPhone has miniaturized electronics that were previously the size of a room or the size of a car. And the miniaturization revolution of hardware has allowed for consumer electronics to play a leading role in the development of space technology, which means that it is now 100th less of the cost of what it was. That applies to rockets too. So rockets have come down by a factor of 10 at least, and in some cases 100. To be able to put something the size of a burrito into Earth orbit is now costing, $50K or less. And that's something that just completely changes accessibility. So what that means for the moon is that our closest neighbor is now more accessible than ever. financially, technologically. And during the Obama era, there was a big focus on Mars, right? But as we went into the Trump sort of era, there was a much more significant focus on the moon. And that's just speaking from a United States perspective, but other countries are very, very much continuing the journey of space technology throughout this time. Like China's been focused on very consistent lunar technology development. Russia's been involved in the development of nuclear modules that help pieces of technology survive in the cold dark of space. And so there's a lot of collaboration that's been going on throughout that time that might have felt like nothing was happening. There has been steady development. It's just been quieter. And now there's a even bigger and sharper uptick because of private sector. And so because all the costs came down, private sector came to the table.
Got it. And you have roots in the climate space, and I know a lot of people in climate-related, activism and stewardship and conservation, like, kind of get a little turned off by space conversations. Like, well, why are we worried about Mars and the moon if we can't take care of planet Earth? And yet, you decided to spend important life energy and focus on the moon. Help me understand your why.
Yeah, thank you. So when I was 15, 16 years old, I got involved in a number of different environmental sustainability activities and organizations, Pachamama Alliance, globally, as well as more local organizations in New Zealand where I grew up. And by the age of 17, 18, I was involved in international climate politics and policy making through youth NGOs and working at the COPs. COP15, COP16 was where I was really participating a lot. And that was an incredibly formative environment to understand the value and challenges of good global governance. For me, my big aha around, again, as a teenager, realizing that I was about to enter into adulthood in a world fraught with polycrisis, right? And we now have that term, but we didn't then, and it was just a feeling then. And so I glommed onto climate, which felt like this incredibly complex intersectional challenge where everything met: economics, culture, all these different aspects. So that was where I put a ton of my energy, and we can talk more about that, building climate movements, policy, etc. But really, when I think back to the moment where the thing that connects the moon and climate happened for me on the steps of the University of Victoria, Wellington. I was sitting one day with a notebook in my hand and trying to consolidate the sense that there was sort of an insight coming forward and I needed to capture it. And I just wrote down 2 words in the notebook, and it was ownership and governance. And really realizing that the way that we believe that we can own things and create economies around that, and the way that we've architected our stewardship and governance formats and the way that we make decisions together are really at the heart of this challenge, because good people are coming together globally in these settings every year, every month, and not making the decisions that need to be made due to a number of factors. So for me, that set the fire in my belly of, well, how do we resolve that challenge? And it's not just about climate. It's about oceans, it's about land, it's about biosphere, it's about space, and all of those things in between.
So ownership and governance, and then how does the moon create that new context? Or what are you thinking about in terms of ownership and governance with the moon?
So the moon is very interesting because there are 2 or 3 different number of treaties that are the groundwork of our international agreements when it comes to how we operate in space. And one of those treaties, the Outer Space Treaty, is widely accepted as an agreement that drives the participation and behavior of all actors. And one of the agreements in that treaty is that no country can go and sort of plant their flag on a planetary body and have it be their territory. So you can't claim the territory of a country on a different planet or planetary body. And so what that basically means is it changes the frame for the rest of the ownership and governance conversation. Because suddenly we have what is sort of an 8th continent, if you like, of planet Earth that cannot be claimed in that way,
It's
under
so
an existing
interesting.
statehood.
Sorry to interrupt. That one of the most defining images is us putting our flag on the moon, though.
Indeed, but basically that was symbolic, and that was about, sort of a supremacist race to be the first. But what it means is it doesn't have the weight of the United States being able to say this is ours.
Right.
Yeah. Even though it's an incredible and exciting achievement, it doesn't have that legal implication behind it. So what that then leads to is, how do you govern something together as a planetary family of humans that are about to go to this 8th continent and create, living, even tourism sector is kind of excited about tourism for the moon. And we're not going to be doing that under the jurisdiction of any given government. So that means that we have to create it. And there's a little bit of an edge case in this conversation too, which is that just because a country can't claim an area, does that mean corporations can? Or corporations can't? So that's an entire area of work that we do a lot of thinking about within Open Lunar, and we can talk more about that. But all that is to say, there's an opportunity to, when you think about creating the constitution for a country, there's an opportunity to have a discussion about a lunar constitution of sorts. Now, that is not a piece of language that's in the international community right now. It's not something that is happening, but it's an example of what could occur, is looking at how do we want to write a sort of charter of agreements that say, this is how we're going to organize together on the moon, and this is the sort of parameters for that. The United States showed some leadership a few years ago and created something called the Artemis Accords. So if folks want to look at kind of the latest in that area, the United States has tried to kind of push the boat out a little bit and suggest an Artemis Accords framework for some of that guidance. But there is by no means an international consensus. There is a contentious treaty called the Moon Treaty. So again, if there's any sort of people who want to nerd out on the details, the Moon Treaty is contentious because it doesn't have sufficient signatories to be kind of considered the real deal when it comes to the big players haven't signed it, if that makes sense. But it does contain a lot of very good initial thinking, especially with regards to the stewardship of lunar land and resource. So it does have some stipulations in the Moon Treaty for how to handle those problems. But again, there's not a lot of existing consensus around how to do that right.
So on the Open Lunar Foundation website, it says that the vision is a peaceful, cooperative presence on the moon for the benefit of all life. And so I'm taking it that Open Lunar Foundation is the nonprofit vehicle which is expressing these inquiries and this work that you've been engaged in. Can you share more about how did this foundation come to be and its origins?
Absolutely. Open Lunar is very special as a founding story because it wasn't created by any one individual's sort of maniacal idea that they then ran with. It was created by community. It was created by a community of people who've been working in the space industry for some up to 40, 50 years of participation in the industry. And I had the incredible opportunity to come into this industry, to participate in the space industry for the first time in the context of co-creating Open Lunar with this community. And I was one of the only people in the room bringing an environmental background, bringing a climate background, bringing a governance background. So that was a wonderful invitation, and one that I'm just, so thankful to have had. And incredible group of astronauts, people in important strategy roles at the European Space Agency, people working in leadership roles in the private sector, some of our best up-and-coming values-driven space companies and their teams working with us at the beginning in the early days. So the conversation that created Open Lunar, to get really specific, started in 2014 at a conference that was held at DFJ that was focused on the question, how might we settle the moon for the cheapest amount possible if we collaborated radically? And the answer that came out of that, and again, that was co-hosted by some amazing leaders like Steve Jurvetson, Will Marshall, et cetera, at DFJ. However, the answer was single-digit billions, if the world worked together really well, could help us create lunar settlement. And at the time, this was a very radical suggestion. Fast track that, 3-4 years later, that conversation was still happening, but very quietly. And so it took us until about 2018 to actually create the organization and put that legal incorporation in place. And since then, we've been 5 years in. We've done a number of different experiments with regards to hardware, software, and a more sort of softer sciences, law, policy, coordination efforts to be able to bring the sector together and make agreements.
So is that the end game? That it's really like, how do we settle on the moon in a more harmonious way, or are we trying to draw these lessons back to Earth, or what are the driving goals that you have in exploring this space?
Yeah, I think any one of our leadership team would certainly say that we would love to see a future on the moon that when anyone on Earth looks up at the moon, they can be proud of what's happening there. And as all of us know, the moon has played an incredibly important spiritual, practical, physical role in our Earth system for as long as the Earth has been around, right? There's an argument to be made that life wouldn't have happened on Earth in the way that it had without the movement of the tides, and therefore maybe we owe life to the moon, right? There's all these very important questions about the role of the moon in Earth's history. And so we like to see it as an Earth-Moon system. And the Earth-Moon system is something that it's not about going away, it's about extending into our Earth-Moon system the values that we want to see. So people look up at the moon and have a soul-searching experience probably every time they do it. And what I would love to see is really incredible examples of economic and governance innovation that teach us what is possible for our biosphere. So we know that our oceans and our atmosphere and our land masses operate in this incredibly interconnected way. You can't just chop off one part of the ocean and manage it differently than the part next to it, although we do. And I would love to be able to put into practice some really integrated and thoughtful governance systems for the moon that are focused on the stewardship and preservation of that place, but preservation while living and working with it, right? So not just protecting it and not touching it, but having a really mindful relationship with the moon. And so to be able to model that, examples such as cooperatively owned solar panels. There's a very special place on the moon called the Peaks of Eternal Light, which is a beautiful name. So imagine that you're standing sort of at the edge of a crater and looking at these peaks. And they're peaks of eternal light because they never experience darkness.
Wow.
The sun always touches them, no matter how the moon is oriented. And they are right next to another very, very special place on the moon, which is permanently shadowed regions, PSRs. And so the peaks of eternal light are very, very tall, and they're around some craters on the South Pole, such as Shackleton's crater, where in this unique landscape, there is perpetual light and perpetual darkness. Some of the hottest land on the moon, some of the coldest land on the moon, right? These are special for a number of reasons, because these are the kinds of landscapes that we could decide how to govern them very carefully. They are unique. It's not like the equatorial zone on the moon, which is a lot of where it's easier to land on the equator. It's an easier shot, basically. Harder to land on the poles. So when we land on the equator, governing how we behave in that area is not as sensitive. It's not as sensitive an environment. But when we come to special areas like the PSRs and the peaks of eternal light, we want to figure out how to utilize them carefully and share that resource. So if you could imagine something like an incredible solar panel array on the peaks of eternal light, providing perpetual power for that region, right? And having basically a shared utility, public infrastructure, if you like, for a lunar populace. And in the permanently shadowed regions, one of the reasons why they are just incredibly important is because they have water in them. They have ice in them. Now, it's as hard as granite, so it's going to be really hard to get it out. And there's a whole bunch of, scientific information we could go into about how challenging excavating from granite density is when you have 1/6 gravity and you don't have the leverage for, if a digger tried to dig, the digger would just lift itself off the surface because its weight's not enough to push, right? So there's a whole lot of complexity there. But if you've got perpetual power and water, that's an incredible starting point for a conversation about utilities and infrastructure for a populace, right? So these are really special places. And if we can figure out how to utilize those resources. Oh, that's interesting turn of phrase, isn't it? Utilize those resources rather than steward, But that's part of the exploration of this work, is figuring out how do we orient? Are we in that mindset of utilization or are we in that mindset of stewardship, right? And it's a continuous kind of back and forth and living question. So solar panels could be a possibility. That would be a very expensive thing. And therefore, it's a very exciting possibility for co-investment. There are many alternatives for how the future on the moon could play out. Some of those are more monopoly oriented. And I would suppose that just based on my knowledge and experience, if we do nothing, we will have monopolies because that's kind of the direction of where things are headed. There will be institutions that specialize and create monopoly around the thing that they have to offer in that environment. And then there will be some sharing and interface between them. But the question is, can we get more collaborative than that? And can we co-invest and co-govern?
This is a bit of a tangent. I haven't really thought about it much, but I'm curious what you think, given your context of being a moon nerd, about like mining the moon and asteroids. And, you know, what I've heard is like, well, obviously there's the, oh gosh, are we going to really go take our fancy diggers up to space and start to extract, you know, from these other planetary beings and objects? Or the other hand, it's like, well, isn't that better than doing it inside the Amazon rainforest where there's no people and there's very little life seemingly to put at risk, that we could, you know, potentially start to derive some of our resource needs from outer space? And that's about as much as I kind of understand the arguments and the thinking, but curious what you think.
Yeah, I think this is a very common curiosity for people, is to think about how can we maintain the sort of Garden of Eden of Earth and utilize space resources for the more kind of rugged material and mineral wealth creation that we want. You know, build an iPhone on the moon and then ship it to the Earth type stuff. The reality is, and I am quite a realist with this kind of thing, the reality is that it's extremely difficult to even consider extracting that kind of thing from asteroids. And asteroids are also very far away. I don't think people really understand how far away, and they're moving at high speed. Like, I just don't think people really pay much attention to the details of that.
The movies make it seem easy.
Yeah. So, I mean, maybe, but not right now. Like Open Lunar Foundation, in the way that I have been thinking and we have been thinking as a team, we think on the 10-year time frame because we look for leverage and we look for how do we turn the arc of the moral universe in the right direction? How do we use our crowbar to kind of turn the needle a little bit now and have a better outcome? But with a lot of foresight, right? So when it comes to thinking about really hypothetical long-term futures, about whether it's going to be better on a number of criteria to do extraction one way or the other, we just don't actually give it a lot of thought, to be honest. I think that, again, coming back to an Earth-Moon system frame of mind is an extremely helpful thing to refer to.
Yeah.
I think a lot of our sustainability challenges on Earth have been created by very linear thinking, sort of like inputs, outputs, throw it away, right? And so that mindset and sort of the lack of a more circular economy is going to pose a problem in space just as much as it poses a problem on Earth. So the idea of sort of extending that thought and just benefiting from a bunch of great minerals, but using the same mentality, I don't think it's going to do that well. As a counterexample, a lot of the lunar community is very interested in the reuse of materials. So, for example, if we have a ton of different machines, robotics that are going to be on the surface of the moon, and they're going to die. They're going to become no longer active. Their battery systems are going to fail. What happens to all those circuit boards?
Sure.
What happens to all that solar panel array system? The idea of being able to create a modular, standardized, reusable, plug-and-play ability to use each other's materials once they are no longer in service is of interest to the industry.
Yeah,
which is an exciting paradigm.
Totally. I was going to ask you because, like, yeah, it does seem like we're already creating a lot of space junk. And from what you're suggesting with consumer electronics enabling a whole new renaissance of space exploration and technologies, that, you know, we're just like throwing all this stuff out in space. Are we going to start having like moon landfills, or how are we going to manage all of this? And how prevalent is that conversation in the space community?
I would say it's a little bit more alarmist than it needs to be right now. I think that the very legitimate concerns about Earth orbit being very challenged with lots of activity, right? Starlink, etc. The pros and cons of having something like Starlink be positive and, impacting astrology and all these things, those are creating a lot of attention around that issue. And the reality is that there's just not enough stuff on the moon, and there won't be for a long time to have that problem in that context. But it's good to plan for the cost efficiency and environmental efficiency of reusability regardless. Yeah.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is like that we have the technology context and backdrop. There's a renaissance of going to the moon and getting more active with the moon and other forms of space technology, and you have this beautiful frame of the Earth-Moon system, and that we have this new frame and canvas and opportunity for fresh thinking and ideas across all of these different holistic, whether it's things like modularity and reusability, or whether it's things like governing commons pool resources and public infrastructure and planning from first principles. And I know you've done a lot of thinking around governance in particular, and governance and ownership, which I'd love to dive into. But maybe before we get to that, just hear a little bit more about your background in the climate space. And I know from a New Zealand perspective, you've had a really strong influence and ripple through the organizations that you've been a part of and that you have humbly helped, start and steward. Can you share a bit more about the journey on that side?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I was very lucky to have a number of situations where I was shoulder tapped, or I put my hand up and other people agreed to take me in, or someone mentored me. And I guess I start off by saying that because I think there's a lot of narratives when it comes to sort of like self-made people and like all of that. I just feel like I benefited so much from such a supportive environment in New Zealand, and I could spend a ton of time listing names of people who went out of their way to help like a 16-year-old with way too much excitement and a bunch of like raw capacity. Like I just really wanted to give, but needed a lot of direction too. So really want to honor all of that. I think ever since I've been very young, I have a very strong sense of responsibility. And for me, showing up into the conversation at a young age about environmental crisis and climate crisis, I felt an enormous weight of responsibility. And that actually increased, not decreased. So every time I took a step more into the community and into the conversation, I found more things that needed to be done and more issues. And so that, really, really established my sense of being committed to that work. Practically what happened was that I had the opportunity to go to Copenhagen, which was a very, very seminal moment for the international climate movement. And it was sort of a ripping open of all of my previous assumptions about how global governance worked. And I wouldn't say that I had like the cliche, like shocking disappointment and disheartedness that I think a lot of people did. I think it kind of put just a fire in me around like, oh, okay, there are no grownups in this room. No one's coming. Like we have to be the people who do the thing. Right. So throughout that process, I was also getting very interested in the substance. For me, it was less about this kind of, I think these days there's a lot of hype around like climate it isn't the problem. It is the result of a bunch of decisions, but it isn't actually the problem. The problem is in like forestry and food and transportation. And so I was really turning my attention to the drivers, right? And understanding those and what were the incentives to have us in those positions in the first place. And the more and more I got into those, the more I realized that on the global stage, New Zealand had a very special role to play. Tiny nation state with an outsized voice, and tiny nation state with an agricultural economy, but that it's considered like a Western democratic European country, but its economic structure looks like a global South country. Like it's a very weird country, right? Love it. And I know you know all of this yourself, but I was like, okay, this is very unique. So what we started to understand was that if we influenced the New Zealand position, we thought other things would change because we felt like New Zealand did have a role to play. So we created an organization called Generation Zero in 2010, which New Zealanders will be familiar with, but others won't, It was part of the International Youth Climate Movement at that time. So there are other international organizations that created very similar things. And we had the benefit of being in friendship and camaraderie with a number of other young people from Nepal, India, Australia, et cetera. The list goes on, that were all creating these in their own nations at the same time. And so what we did was we focused on a combination between policy, which we really saw as creating the incentives for the market, and young people's participation in voting, and kind of the feedback loop there. And so we mobilized a voter bloc that wasn't otherwise particularly married to any one political position at that time, and helped a ton of young people understand that their vote could be a climate vote. Now this sounds kind of obvious, but at that time it was not obvious.
Totally.
And very, very much not a given. It had a ton of uptake, and we were a founding group of 7 friends. And one of the very special things, if people are looking at how to found organizations like this, I think one of the special things that we did was that we each lived in different cities. And it meant that we never really had like the one city that was the hub. We were nationwide from day zero. You know, we had Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, Hamilton, Dunedin from day one. And it allowed us to show leadership in all of our local environments and immediately create national presence. So we went from 7 founders to about 200 volunteers in a couple of months with a very clear sense of strategy. And of those 200 volunteers, a lot of them, I would say, showed up ready to grow. And our organization, and especially my style of leadership, I think, in the organization, and I know others on the team would agree, was focused on leadership development. Like, there was no way that us, like, as a small group, like, I think a lot of times these days, people are looking to automate things or make things like cheaper and simpler and have smaller teams that are more technically driven. We didn't think like that. We were just thinking more a combination between digital and grassroots, quite an Obama era style methodology, I would say. So anyway, focusing on leadership development then meant that we had 200 leaders instead of 200 people that were licking envelopes, right? Which at that time was also unique because a lot of movement building is done in a way that diminishes the role of the volunteer and gives them something boring to do.
How old were these volunteers roughly? Like, are we talking 20s or teenagers? Or
I would say a little bit of a combination. Yeah, we definitely had more programming for younger people over time because it was hard for a 14-year-old to show up and take initiative. But that wasn't too hard for an 18-year-old.
And when can you start voting in New Zealand?
18.
18.
Yeah.
So you had people even younger than 18 influencing voters, but unable to vote themselves.
Yeah. But mobilizing their parents, grandparents, etc. Yeah.
And this was pre-Greta, you know, I mean, was it as obvious then that the youth played such an outsized impact and role in climate organizing?
I think that we were realizing that in real time. Like, we had an advisory board of a number of incredible leaders in our country that were giving us feedback from the perspective that they had led many organizations surrounding this issue over time in their lifetimes. And their feedback to us was, you're succeeding because of this youthful energy that you're coming with, and the intergenerational justice narrative is very compelling, especially for, you know, the grandparent population, for example, feeling responsible and things like that. But yeah, the growth curve was wild. By the following year, we had 13,000 people involved, and managing that growth rate is a lot of work. And it was an incredibly exciting and formative experience for all of us. And I like to think, you know, everyone who was involved in that period of time, not only did they contribute to a sea change in the position of a country's climate policy, but they also built themselves, you know. And we have this whakatoki or proverb in the Wellington region that was created by a really inspiring man called Bruce, who built a marae for all iwi. And he said, "Those who build the house are built by the house." And I think that a lot of Generation Zero participation was also about the development of the humans that showed up to create it. And we had a very significant commitment that our internal process was empowering. So it was not simply a campaigning organization that, you know, you were on a listserv and you were asked to show up on a certain day and like do your thing and go home. It was a journey for each person, including the discovery of their own agency. And so when it comes to things like governance, that was already on our minds every day. It was who's participating in decision making in this organization? How can we create fractal, polycentric circles of decision making? How do we have a matrix shaped organization so that each part of the organization can think for itself without having to always go back to the center to make sense and build strategy? So that was very real time work for us in the leadership team, was to be able to facilitate that level of orienting so that people could then take the best action, but also not be encumbered by one another. An ongoing challenge, as everyone I think who's built organizations knows. 10 years on from that, 10 years plus, I guess it's 13 years now. But about 10 years into it, we finally got the result that we wanted to create, which was lasting legislation for climate mitigation in New Zealand.
Right. And that was the Zero Carbon Act, which was signed into law. And I remember Climate Change Minister James Shaw in the speech at Parliament, I believe, in signing that defining legislation, credited Generation Zero for really making an outsized influence and impact on the shape and the implementation of that.
Which was incredibly thoughtful, given that most politicians would just be very happy to pat themselves on the back. So again, the uniqueness of the New Zealand context to be gracious in that way and that particular government. But yeah, we were very cross-party in that. If anyone wanted, again, to emulate some of this, I think that they would need to focus on cross-party participation. Just because a Green Party politician was the one to stand on the podium that day had nothing to do with our goal. Like we didn't, it was not necessary to us to see the progressive movement as the prerequisite to the work. We needed to see everyone on board. Yeah.
And how did you spend, your professional time between the experience at Generation Zero and Open Lunar Foundation?
Yeah, so I have a bad habit of getting involved at the beginning, and I am on a journey and very much on that journey for sure, in a mature way now, to think about how to start things well. Very passionate about not just setting something on fire at the beginning and walking away, but I have also done my fair share of that, So I've basically had a pattern of co-creating organizations for about 2 and a bit years, and then becoming more of an advisor and then doing something else. And what a wonderful way to spend your 20s. So exciting, so fun, so interesting, etc. And also so tough for people who are in the succession positions. Thank you, all those people. In between, after Generation Zero, I actually joined an organization called Inspiral. That is run by my dear friend Josh Weil and a ton of other friends. I believe you've already interviewed Josh.
Yeah, check out the interview with Josh.
Love Josh.
Dive on Inspiral. Yeah.
Very insightful and inspiring leader. And he actually created Inspiral at the same time as we were starting Gen Zero, and we were already friends. We had, again, he's one of these people who, thank you to the giant amount of mentors and tuakana that I had at that time to be able to walk alongside people who were ahead of me. And so I got involved in Inspiral partly because I had already run several nonprofits. I was really interested in how business worked, and I felt completely, an infant in that environment. And I had also worked in government by that time after university, and I felt like government was moving way too slow for anything that needed to be done, and there was a ton of cultural challenges and barriers. So I was interested in what at that time was called social enterprise. And that was kind of the buzzword of the day. Now it's probably something else. But how do we create businesses that have in their incentive structures themselves the value that we want to create for our communities and our environment? So I was involved in a number of different organizations inside Inspiral. And Inspiral is sort of a network of businesses, if you like. So I entered in as a free agent, looking for a way to be helpful, looking for a way to deploy my skills. And I was able to play a key role in a number of those things. Probably one that people may know about or might be interested in, because we're talking about governance today, is Loomio. I was helping to run the business team at Loomio. Loomio is a open source software, still exists today. People can go check it out, loomio.org. And it helps to facilitate people to make good decisions together online. So it's a governance tool For online decision making, it's very oriented towards consensus. It's very different than a lot of the technology we see today around quadratic voting or any of these more kind of mathematical decision making tools. This is about dialogue. It's about people listening to each other's perspectives, being able to understand why someone has the position that they have, being able to relate and build a bridge and be able to make a decision together as a result. So that's what that tool does. It's very good for boards too. So I was involved in the sales team and the deploying team for how do we provide that as a service to large organizations. So I was doing enterprise sales and enterprise services, and it was a wonderful experience. And that kind of journey took me more and more towards asking, what is something that can really have the leverage that we need to kind of cut through the noise. There was a whole lot of different projects that I had the privilege of being involved in that kind of felt like I was pulling a thread to kind of get into that discovery position of what has high leverage. So some of the things that had high leverage at that time, and I think still have some of this, are accelerator programs, like venture studios and labs, things that are designed to churn out people who build really good things and who build them well from day one. I think is like a really interesting frame of reference. And funding those things well, having the right philanthropic values and incentives to fund those things well as well. So I did a ton of that over and over again in lots of different countries, and sort of did a bit of a world tour of different theories of change in a way. And I kind of came towards the lunar stuff at a time when I was feeling particularly trapped in pre-existing mindsets, trapped in pre-existing incentives. At that time, I had been working with amazing organizations like WWF International, Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, all of which have awesome roles to play, but I could just really feel the inertia of the big organizations, wheels turning really slowly. And to me, going back to a word that you used around canvas, template, something that we can really strike out and create a blueprint for something that we want to see without a lot of the pre-existing friction, was very, very exciting. And so that was where the moon became an advantageous opportunity to say, what can we model? What can we really model and showcase that other people will then literally look at it and say, I want that. Let's do that.
I love that vision. Yeah, and it just seems to me that you have been kind of consistently ahead of the curve, whether it was zero carbon youth climate campaigning many years before that became the trend, or with Lumio and collective decision making. I remember when, the idea of an open source online governance tool was kind of this radical niche, wasn't really. I was in Silicon Valley at the time when you were doing Lumio, and I remember kind of like the just very cultural, difference and like lack of resonance in what Silicon Valley Web 2 phenomenon was interested in at that point. And then here we are now with Web 3 going into all of those threads of open source tools to make decisions and to do new forms of coordination and governance, and really the entire Inspiral sets of projects and fractals and communities. We're exploring things that are now being called different things like DAOs and so forth, but it's really a lot of the same primitives and questions underneath. And then, of course, now with the moon, I have a sense that you're ahead of the curve yet again. I do want to, really dig into some of the patterns and lessons around governance, because you have such a wide-ranging and thoughtful set of experiences. And since a big part of the theme here is around what we're moving into with Web3 and crypto, maybe through that lens, like how are you sensing what you've learned about governance and what we can all learn in this time?
Yeah, it's a very big question. And I want to honor you as well for being on a lot of these journeys too. I think there's a community of us who've been on this inquiry, in this set of inquiries for a long time. And it's really great to be in it together. I think that best practices for governance look really different in different environments. Like, I'm not a zealot when it comes to there being like a silver bullet for this. I think that there are some instances where cross-sector dialogue is the right thing. And, when you look at examples of like the food lab with like Unilever and the Indian government and like development banks coming together and creating standards for, the development of like organic certifications and things like that. Some of those governance environments are necessarily voluntary, outside state systems, and led by industry. Sometimes that's inappropriate. Sometimes you need a government to have a more kind of top-down approach to making a policy. Sometimes some of the governance that I'm really excited about for states is creating deliberative democracy environments with people from community. So there are lots of different ways to do that. You can create citizens panels on specific topics, such as what has been done in France around their climate policy. You can do that for local government environments where you basically say, okay, we need one person from each zip code. We're going to randomly pick you, come to a meeting, and let's make decisions together. There are ways to do that center citizen decision making. There are also ways of doing that where citizens are part of a caucus of elected officials. There are tons of different ways to kind of do this. I think that what a lot of these have in common is deliberation. And I'm very interested in this, both as an academic. This is a lot of what my study was around, was what does it look like to create deliberative democracy environments? Some of the things that we need to see more of in our governance, and what I don't see a ton of in our crypto governance experiment environments, is people hearing where each other are coming from.
Tell me more about that.
Well, when people hear where someone else is coming from, they listen very differently. Like if you there was an incredible example of this done around dialogue on COVID economic recovery in Michigan. But one of the amazing things in this film that's captured is that when someone from a very conservative political position who is very anti-masking talks to someone who has lost every single member of their family to COVID, you have a different conversation. And they're both crying. Right? And there's something about this other level of connection that has to happen. It's a prerequisite to being able to make an intellectual decision well. And I'm not saying that we need to be very kumbaya and kind of emotional about everything. However, there's a ton of evidence that shows that like emotion is information too, right? And we just kind of rip it out of a lot of our processes. This is also true in Indigenous participation in Western governance systems. In Te Ao Māori, in the Māori world, in the conflict of sort of co-governance evolutions in New Zealand, I think I would love to see more of the intelligence of Te Ao Māori protocol in New Zealand government decision-making, right? And there have been rules, and again, this comes from my academic background, there have been rules put in place for a long time that prevent like a government submission being made in the form of a song and things like that. And that is a kind of intelligence that would be wonderful to have more of in our structures, right? But the incompatibility of it and the refusal to include different forms of intelligence in our decision-making is reducing our capacity to make good decisions. Yeah. So our sort of epistemologies and our knowledge systems around what we believe to be rational thinking prevents us from making good decisions, which is very ironic. It's self-limiting. Yeah.
Totally.
So I see that a lot in crypto and in DAOs, even the ones that have amazing intentions. I would love to challenge that whole community to have a more rigorous set of experiments around, I don't know, perhaps you could just call it like being human together. Can have a DAO that I've been advising on a little bit with respect to the moon stuff. And they're doing great, but one of the things that I would love to see them do is have a discussion in real time before a decision goes live on Snapshot. Right? Can be as simple as that. That's the kind of thing that I think we need more of in all of the governance environments.
Yeah, it's such a tricky space because we're simultaneously trying to embark on new forms of coordination through often some sort of token that stitches us together. So it's no longer a geographical shape or even a hardly defined organizational affiliation. And then we're also trying to learn how to do this where we're mostly distributed. So rather than getting all of that information of being face to face, it's through Discord emojis and forums. And so you must have thought about this in the Lumio context as well, but like, how do you listen more deeply to one another virtually?
Yeah. I think there's a ton of ways to do it. That's the good news. Yeah. I actually think that, you might make a joke about the emojis, but I think it's an incredibly rich piece of information.
Clearly.
Yeah. I think as a facilitator and having, so 10,000 hours level of time in that game, I think that skill set of facilitation is really underutilized in those kind of environments. And that might also be something for people to think about, is how to include facilitation capacity in their development as a community or an institution. The reason I bring that up is that when you have that skill set where you can map out in advance in your head the kind of journey that a group is going to go on, like, okay, so we're going to first sort of have a surface level discussion, and then we're going to get a bit deeper, and then we're going to hear from this kind of person, and that's going to have this kind of impact on their thinking. When you can think like that, you can do that in Slack or in Discord. It's not hard to digitize it. You can say, we're going to have a week where people read this blog together and then write reactions to this blog. And in the process, we're going to do, it's essentially facilitating a collaborative learning experience that levels the playing field and allows people to think together. And then the next week, we're going to get into pairs that is randomly assigned by a Slack app called Donut, and people are going to have 30 minutes online each, and then they're going to report back in Slack about new ideas that they had as a result. You can do this kind of thing easily distributed. People are just not getting creative because I don't think that the prerequisite skill set of the facilitation side is in people's minds.
No.
Yeah.
No. And I mean, I having gone from a Silicon Valley context into New Zealand, I felt like, wow, there was like an entire body of knowledge and practice that you were all doing predominantly in the Inspiral community that I had never seen in startup land. And even though I hadn't worked at a lot of companies, I had certainly like been in the study of organizational building from an entrepreneurial lens. And yet you were all speaking a different language than what I had been exposed to in the United States and in California. So I'm curious, like, how do we build those facilitation capacities and remember and rediscover and skill up? How do we find those people? What are there books? Are there sources? Are there active networks of trainers to go to? Like, how do we do that?
Definitely. There's a lot of it. Yeah. The good news is there's a lot of it. Maybe the bad news is it as more of it exists, it can be watered down too, which is its own challenge. The New Zealand environment is very unique, which I'll just pay a very quick sort of homage to. Inspiral's social and collective and cultural intelligence is part of a lineage. The people, those of us who are involved in creating Inspiral, had been part of communities that had used those skills and toolkits before. And whose parents had been part of communities who had used those skills and toolkits before, and that it comes from schools of thought such as the co-counseling movement of the 70s, which is also where the Values Party came from, which was the first Green Party in the world, out of New Zealand, and also the bicultural context of co-governed country, co-created by the Crown and the Māori world, has its own cultural intelligence that can't be understated, how important the history and protocol of Māori tikanga informs the kind of skill sets that I think we see emerging in the New Zealand sort of impact and entrepreneur environment. It wasn't just someone's good idea one day. It has a lineage, which I think we need to honor and be aware of. So with all that said, there are lineages all over the world. There's an incredible community of practice and skill in Ojai in California. It's really, really good at this work. There's also an incredible set of institutions in Europe that are really, really good at this work, such as like Otto Schama World and sort of ULab, is sort of a big school of thought around there. So there are a lot of hubs.
And the one at Ojai would be with Council.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we'll put links in the show notes to all of these different projects and practices. Who else is inspiring you? What other communities can we link to?
I really like Peter Block as an author, if people want to get nerdy and read some books. He writes really great books on management, which come from a very values-driven place. He's written a book called Stewardship. He's written a book called The Structure of Belonging. Like some really, really good books there. So that's a favorite of mine. But I would say that there's an incredible overlap between, and sometimes surprising disconnect, between the technical implementations of democratic design and these more sort of soft skills around facilitation. And when they are together, it is magical. Yeah.
Yeah. And another theme I'm sensing on this kind of maybe governance or maybe organizational best practices in this new, more virtually distributed set of contexts is how do we also get face-to-face and in person. And I've heard a number of folks that we've talked to in and around the DAO space kind of discovering and experimenting with what is the cadence and what is the format of bringing members of the DAO together, and how those who have been doing those experiments are like, this is super important. And I'm reminded of Inspiral's Summerfest and the in-person gatherings that you all have made a tradition and cultivated as a practice. And wondering if you could speak to these themes a bit.
Yeah, what comes to mind is actually going all the way back to the climate movement. And a lot of studies have been done on what maintains passion and motivation and participation of communities. And some of the statistics show that if an individual has a experience of being grounded in purpose at least every 28 days, they will be continuously committed and participating. And that if you miss a 28-day cycle, there'll be a drop off. This informs a lot of the design of church community architecture. There's a lot of studies that look into this kind of detail. So there's really, really great reasons why spiritual communities meet regularly. There's great reasons why, the sort of design of a campaign that is trying to get someone to divest from a bank or whatever it might be will have a certain set of moments that are designed at a very specific spacing and order. So this is all very evidence-based these days and very data-driven, but you can also feel it in yourself, right? You can get distracted. So I guess that is a very interesting challenge when it comes to being distributed. How we used to handle that in our climate movement environment, again, I mentioned that we were founded nationwide from day one. And so one of the ways in which that was beneficial, again, was being able to have a hub and spoke kind of opportunity, people meeting locally, but people being able to go to each other's cities too, and having a renewed sense of novelty and inspiration and excitement by accessing the same family in a different place, and nationwide summits and opportunities as well. So I wonder what that kind of fractal patterning could look like for some of these more international sort of DAO structures. At the end of the day, it's just a new word for some stuff that we've been doing for a long time, right? But when I think about a DAO that I've been involved with, they've got an enormous amount of participants in China, an enormous amount of participants in the United States, and it is specifically focused on space. And knowing that the space communities politically and technically from China and the US cannot talk to each other, that's an incredible opportunity, right? To have a citizen-led bonding experience and mutual witnessing and knowing what each other's priorities are. And unfortunately, there is tension, right? But that's an opportunity too. So how can a small group of people in Wuhan get together, and a small group of people in Beijing get together, and a small group of people in LA and San Francisco get together, and then those groups have a bigger conversation, trying to find that win-win of getting some in-person time and being realistic about people's physical realities as well. Yeah.
Love it. And in terms of in-person gatherings, we're here at Bioneers. You facilitated an amazing panel yesterday, Aotearoa Observations, with some powerful New Zealand voices from Aotearoa. And I'm curious how it all landed for you and how it's feeling to be representing New Zealand in this context. And obviously you've also lived both here in the Bay Area as well as in New Zealand, and bridging these worlds.
Yeah, I moved to Bay Area in 2015, 2016. I was about 24, and I have lived sort of 50 to 60% of my time in California and New Zealand ever since. And I think probably one of the big things that I'm coming away from yesterday's panel with is just there's some magic in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I think we always knew it, like we've always known it. But every time Aotearoa's passion and insight and courage is witnessed on the world stage, I think it just blows people away. And I can't wait for more of that. I think that there's, especially when it comes to Indigenous participation in the global conversations, I'm just so excited for more of it. And I feel very conflicted about the word New Zealand. And yet it is the word that so many people know. And so if I was to rock up into tell someone I was from Aotearoa, I don't think they would know what I'm talking about.
No.
But at the same time, I understand, Lara, one of our panelists yesterday, turned to me and said, New Zealand was a name given by someone who never went there. They sailed past on a boat and they called it New Zealand and called it a day. And yet that's the word we all know. So I feel very conflicted about these kinds of realities. So I'm still on a journey to figure out what that
I think
means.
we just give it like millions and millions of brand impressions. And,
Yeah.
I just keep referring to Aotearoa and New Zealand together so that people understand where, but, just kind of maybe if they just keep hearing it over and over, that we bring it back to recognition.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Yeah, no, magic, definitely. I've seen a lot of our California-based communities start to understand the magic that is inside Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I think the more that people like you and I facilitate and open up and create manakitanga environments for people to be able to access that, the more connectivity and fireworks are going to come.
Yeah, and we're certainly going to do the best we can at uplifting the mana and the voices of Aotearoa here on this interview series in season 1 and into the future. So you've recently onboarded an executive director at Open Lunar Foundation, and I understand you're able to create a bit more space and your operational responsibilities now. What's enlivening you? What are your inquiries? Where's the puck going to next for Chelsea Robinson?
Yeah, I have a number of curiosities. So I've been leading Open Lunar collaboratively for 5 years, and I'm thrilled with our new humans in leadership. And the things that I am interested in at the moment that I'm thinking about a lot, and I would encourage other people to think about them a lot too, is healthcare. I think healthcare is in a sorry state globally. And I think it's going to undermine everybody's ability to function. I'm really worried about it. And there's more and more signs every day that people are living in constant pain and distress because they think they have to. And I think that that's not okay. And I think that's economic. So the next thing that is really on my mind is, what is the economy incentivizing? And none of this is particularly new to people who think about economics. But I do think that the marriage that we're all starting to discuss in our communities about environmental economics and true cost economies and all of that, I think it's interesting. But I think if I take that into the sort of the third discussion point, which is sort of like, what is the next wave of work we need to do for climate? Climate. It's like a hot topic these days. Like, people who've been working in it for a long time, it's in a way, it's almost overwhelming to see how much of a hype train it is at the moment. But yeah, I think that the real work is economics. Like, I think Kim Stanley Robinson, who spoke on the stage of Bioneers yesterday, and he stood up and he said, I don't know if you were there to hear it, but he said, my book, Ministry of the Future, is not about climate. It's about finance. And I think that is a really, really great example of the fact that is the work now. So when we think about something like healthcare that hurts today, now, people are in pain. And we know that it's actually about financial drivers. And we have rivers and communities that are broken today, and we know it's about financial drivers. I think all things are pointing to finance, reconstruction of finance. But I think it's a really, really tricky topic. So some of the things that I'm concerned about when we talk about nature financialization, having been in LULUCF complicated red plus policy discussions since the age of 17, I have always been, it has been impressed upon me, and I have always been very considerate about the way in which we can't just extend the same privatization mentality towards mysterious interconnected ecological services.
Right.
So I'm really concerned about the way that we might accidentally make something that is very four-dimensional into something that is one-dimensional in the way that we attempt to do nature financialization.
Yeah.
And I am not sold yet on any of the things that I've heard people talk about in the way that people are attempting to tackle this. So, yeah,
I
think
mean, in
that's
terms of the financialization of ecosystem service markets, carbon markets, biodiversity credits, etc.
indeed. The more comprehensive we try and make them, I think the more dangerous they are. Like, I actually think it's like not entirely bad to have like a couple of simple applications of policy-driven financial incentive structures for parts of the economy that we want to see more growth in. Of course, there's risks in all of that, but you can kind of anticipate some of the consequences when you're only doing one installation at a time. Like if you look at incentivizing the growth of manuka in New Zealand, and you want to see and subsidize manuka farms that are both permanent forests on marginal land that are also beekeeping opportunities for high value added manuka honey products. That's a very interesting incentive structure, and it's simple and you can think through the consequences. If you want to talk about a totalizing financial plan for ocean financialization, I don't think any of us are thoughtful enough creatures to take on the implications that we would be creating without even realizing what we're doing.
Yeah. Well, I would love to. Maybe we can do this conversation again in the future and talk more about how our thinking matures and evolves in those spaces, because it does seem like that's where a lot is heading. And also just in terms of the healthcare piece, you know, one interesting thing that we've noticed so far in these interviews is how much well-being, personal health, mental well-being keeps coming out, even though that's not where the questions have necessarily started and directed. So that's been an observation. And I feel too, there's a lot to still be explored between the link of our human health and our ecological health of what we call nature out there. And for people to better understand that connectivity, both from a causal perspective of like, why are we suffering so much and what is making us sick and so forth. And we understand it at some level of like, well, yeah, if the water's dirty and you drink it, then you might feel bad. But we don't seem to be embodying that simplicity of understanding into the way that we think about healthcare more broadly, where ecological health and investment in conservation and regeneration is actually can be directly an investment in our well-being and health as well. But we're still stuck in a sick care paradigm with broken economic incentives and corporate incentives. And so I think we're still probably a long way. But things like the learning environment, where we're witnessing projects really explore like, what does healing on the land look like? You know, the forest can be the new doctor's office, and you know, like there's a lot I think that can be pulled on those threads that I haven't seen too much, you know, out there yet, but it gives me hope.
Yeah, it reminds me of what Matariki said on the stage at Pioneers yesterday as well, around amnesia as a part of colonization. Most of our pharmaceuticals are from plants, so the fact that we don't think that is a problem.
Right.
Yeah. But thank you, and I think that a lot of the best things that have come out of the last few years for me are around practical, legal, economic instruments that work to protect and uphold values. And I think more and more so we're discovering the ways to hack existing systems to do the thing that we want. It's just it takes a while to figure it out, and it might be costly in some cases, but there are some good examples of legal instruments and financial incentive instruments that we can build on, that can become modules in the journeys that we're trying to figure out.
Thank you so much for your work in the world, Chelsea. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you.
Thanks, Matthew.
Wow, I appreciate Chelsea so much. She is so clear and eloquent, and I feel like the communities that she's embedded within, Inspiral, Embassy, Open Lunar, just have a lot to bring to the discourse around Web3 and governance in particular. You can learn more at openlunar.org. If you enjoyed this conversation, you might want to check out the conversation we had with Jessie Kate Shingler, co-founder of Open Lunar. Also, Joshua Weil, co-founder of Inspiral. Or you may be interested in the one with Derek Razo from Purpose Foundation. And finally, Aaron Matariki Carr from River. Links are in the show notes. All of those conversations and more can be found on maearth.com. Please like, share, subscribe, comment, tell your friends, and give us feedback along the way. Thanks for being on the journey with us. We look forward to seeing you in the next one.